A 17-year-old with a guitar and a grudge called her out in front of a Nashville crowd, mocking her as Ms. Traditional. Karoline Leavitt didn't argue or walk away, she just picked up her guitar. Nobody knew she was the daughter of a rock legend. So why did he think she'd back down before we dive into today's story? If you find this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming stories. You're also welcome to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Every piece of feedback is truly valuable in helping Crossfire Justice improve. Thank you so much for always being with us. And now, let's jump into this thrilling and unexpected story together. The evening air at Maple Ridge Park in Nashville carried the scent of grilled corn and the hum of 1,000 voices, all gathered for the annual music festival. Families lounged on checkered blankets. Kids chased glow sticks, and teenagers clustered near the stage, their phones glowing as they filmed the opening acts. The string lights overhead swayed gently, casting a warm glow over the crowd. Max, a lanky 17-year-old with a shock of dyed blue hair, strode onto the wooden stage, his electric guitar slung low across his chest. His worn sneakers squeaked against the polished planks, and his black hoodie bore a faded logo from some indie band. Max was no stranger to attention. His TikTok videos, where he riffed on guitar and ranted against what he called stuffy conservatives, had earned him a small but fierce following. Tonight, he felt invincible, the crowd's energy fueling his swagger. He adjusted the mic, his grin sharp, and scanned the audience until his eyes landed on Karoline Leavitt, a local figure known for her conservative commentary. She stood near the front, her jeans and plaid shirt blending into the casual crowd, her auburn hair tied back loosely. Max didn't know much about her beyond her politics, and that was enough for him to decide she was out of place here, among the free spirits and open hearts of the festival. He leaned into the mic, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Hey, Miss Traditional. Think you can keep up with me on this stage?" The words dripped with mockery, each syllable a challenge. A ripple of gasps spread through the crowd, followed by scattered cheers from Max's peers and low jeers from older folks who recognized Karoline. A teenage girl with a nose ring nudged her friend, whispering, "He's gonna roast her." Karoline's face remained still, her hazel eyes locked on Max, unblinking, as if she were measuring something he couldn't see. Her hands rested calmly at her sides, but her fingers twitched slightly, brushing the edge of a worn leather guitar case propped against her leg. Max strummed a quick, taunting chord, the sound sharp and electric, daring her to respond. The festival organizer, a wiry man named Tom with a clipboard tucked under his arm, stood off stage, his brow furrowing. He'd booked Max for his viral fame, not for picking fights, and Karoline was just a guest, not a scheduled performer. Tom glanced at his assistant, unsure whether to step in, but the crowd's growing buzz held him back. Max's taunt wasn't just a challenge, it was a dismissal, as if Karoline's very presence on this ground among these people was a mistake. To Max, she represented everything he mocked: online rigid ideals, old-school values, a world that didn't get him. He expected her to shrink, to wave off the challenge with a polite smile and retreat into the crowd. After all, what could she know about music? About the raw, pulsing freedom of a guitar in hand? The crowd leaned forward, some holding their breath, others murmuring bets on whether she'd even try. Karoline's lips parted slightly, as if she might speak, but she didn't. Instead, she bent down, her movement slow and deliberate, and unlatched her guitar case. The faint creak of the hinges was lost in the crowd's hum, but Max caught it, and for a split second, his smirk faltered. Why wasn't she backing down? If you've ever been singled out, judged before you could even open your mouth. Then you know how Karoline felt standing there, the weight of 1,000 eyes on her. She straightened up, her expression unreadable, and took a step toward the stage. The air crackled with something unspoken, something Max hadn't anticipated. He'd lit a spark, but what kind of fire was coming? Karoline Leavitt stood at the edge of the Maple Ridge Park stage, the Nashville night wrapping around her like a familiar shawl. The festival's pulse thrummed through the crowd laughter, clinking soda cans, the distant squeal of kids on a bounce house. Her fingers grazed the frayed strap of an old leather guitar case, its surface scuffed from years of quiet travels. Max's taunt still echoed in her ears, his voice sharp with the kind of certainty only youth could wield. Ms. Traditional, he'd called her, as if her plaid shirt and steady gaze marked her as an outsider in this sea of tie-dye and rebellion. The words cut, not because they were cruel, but because they dismissed her without a second thought. She'd felt this before, eyes that sized her up, voices that assumed they knew her story. Karoline's hazel eyes swept the crowd, catching flashes of amusement, curiosity, and something harder to name. A teenage girl with a nose ring leaned toward her friend, her voice carrying just enough to sting. "She's just a talking head, not a musician." The words landed like a pebble in still water, rippling through Karoline's chest. Her lips tightened, a reflex she'd learned to hide, but her hand slipped into her pocket, closing around a small silver guitar pick. Its edges were worn smooth, the engraved initials J.H. barely visible in the dim light. That pick was more than a tool. It was a tether to a past she rarely spoke of, a reminder of late nights in a cramped garage, learning chords under her father's patient gaze. Max, oblivious, strummed a quick, showy riff on his electric guitar, the notes slicing through the air like a dare. His blue hair caught the stage lights, and his grin widened as the crowd cheered, feeding his bravado. To him, this was a game, a chance to flex his fame and put Karoline in her place. He didn't see the way her shoulders squared, the way her breath steadied, as if she were bracing for something heavier than a stage. The festival organizer, Tom, hovered off stage, his clipboard clutched like a shield. He was a wiry man in his 50s, his glasses slipping down his nose as he glanced between Max and Karoline. He'd booked Max for his viral videos, expecting a lively set, not a public challenge. Karoline was just a guest invited to enjoy the festival, not to perform. Tom's assistant, a young woman with a lanyard, whispered, "Should we stop this?" But Tom hesitated, caught by the crowd's growing energy. If he stepped in, would it look like he was taking sides? Karoline felt the weight of their indecision, the way it left her exposed. She wasn't here to prove anything, not really. She'd come to listen, to feel the music, to remember what it was like before her name became a talking point. But Max's challenge wasn't just about music. It was about who got to belong on this stage, in this moment. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, some calling for her to step up, others betting she'd walk away. A man in a trucker hat shook his head, muttering, "She's out of her league." Karoline's fingers tightened around the pick, its cool metal grounding her. If you've ever been judged before you've even had a chance to speak, then you know what stirred in her heart, not anger, but a quiet resolve. She wasn't here to fight Max, to match his fire with her own. She was here to answer, to let something deeper speak. Her boots scuffed the ground as she took a step forward, her gaze steady on the stage. The guitar case at her side felt heavier now, not with its weight, but with what it carried. What was inside that case, and why did it matter so much? The crowd leaned in, sensing a shift, though they couldn't name it yet. Max's riff faded, and for a moment, The only sound was the soft creak of Karoline's case as she reached for the latches. The Maple Ridge Park stage in Nashville glowed under a canopy of string lights, the night air thick with the scent of popcorn and anticipation. The crowd, a patchwork of families, teens, and retirees, pressed closer to the wooden platform, their phones aloft, capturing the unfolding drama. Max, his blue hair catching the spotlight, stood center stage, his electric guitar gleaming like a weapon. His fingers tore across the fretboard, unleashing a blistering solo that seemed to vibrate the very ground. Notes cascaded in a frenzy of speed, each one sharper than the last. His performance a spectacle of raw energy and showmanship. The crowd erupted, teenagers whooping, some chanting his name, their voices blending into a roar that fueled his grin. He ended with a theatrical flourish, sliding to his knees and pointing his guitar at Karoline Leavitt, who stood just beyond the stage's edge. "Your turn, if you dare," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, as if her mere presence was a joke. The words landed like a slap, implying she was out of her depth, a politician playing at being an artist. A few onlookers snickered, one man in a baseball cap muttering, "She's got no shot." Karoline's face remained calm, almost distant, her hazel eyes fixed on Max, not with anger but with something quieter, deeper. Her plaid shirt hung loosely on her frame, and her boots scuffed softly as she climbed the stage steps. Each movement deliberate, unhurried. The crowd's chatter faded, replaced by a hum of curiosity. She knelt beside her leather guitar case, its scratches catching the light, and unlatched it with a soft click. Inside lay a sunburst Fender Stratocaster, its body worn but polished, its scars telling stories nobody in the crowd could guess. She lifted it gently, as if greeting an old friend, and slung the strap over her shoulder. The festival organizer, Tom, stood frozen off stage, his clipboard forgotten in his hands. His eyes widened at the sight of the guitar, a flicker of recognition crossing his face, but he said nothing, his lips pressed tight. Max laughed, a loud, dismissive bark that echoed through the speakers. "Nice relic," he said, leaning into the mic. "Hope you know how to use it." The crowd tittered, some cheering for Max, others shifting uncomfortably, sensing the tension. Karoline adjusted the guitar's strap, her fingers brushing the silver pick in her pocket, its engraved initials J.H., a secret she carried close. She didn't respond to Max's jab, didn't meet his gaze. Instead, she stepped to the mic, her boots steady on the stage, and tested a single chord. The note rang out, clear and warm, cutting through the crowd's murmur like a bell. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make a few heads turn. A teenage girl with a nose ring, who'd mocked Karoline earlier, lowered her phone, her brow furrowing. Max's laugh faded, his confidence unshaken but his eyes narrowing. He'd expected her to fumble, to back out, to prove his point that she didn't belong here. But Karoline's calm, the way she held the guitar like it was part of her, stirred something uneasy in him. The air grew heavy, charged with a shift nobody could name. If you've ever been pushed to prove yourself, to step into a spotlight you didn't ask for, then you know what Karoline felt as she stood there. She wasn't here to outshine Max, not really. She was here because something in her refused to let his judgment stand. The crowd leaned in, their phones still recording. But their eyes were on her now. Not him. Tom's assistant whispered, "Is she actually going to play?" The question hung unanswered, as Karoline's fingers hovered over the strings, ready to speak in a language Max hadn't anticipated. What would she play? And how would it change the stage they shared? The Maple Ridge Park stage in Nashville stood bathed in the soft glow of string lights, their amber hue mingling with the deepening twilight. The crowd, a tapestry of young and old, families and friends, had grown quieter now, their earlier cheers giving way to a hushed anticipation. The air carried the faint sweetness of cotton candy, undercut by the earthy scent of trampled grass. Karoline Leavitt stood alone at the center of the stage, her sunburst Fender Stratocaster cradled in her arms, its worn finish catching the light like a map of forgotten roads. She tuned the guitar with quiet precision, her fingers moving with a practiced grace that seemed to belong to someone else, someone who'd lived a life far from the public eye she now occupied. Max's taunt still lingered in the air. His jab about her old-school vibes had drawn a few laughs from his teenage fans, but Karoline didn't look at him. Her hazel eyes were fixed on the strings, her breath steady, as if she were reaching for something just beyond the stage. Max leaned against his amp, his blue hair damp with sweat, his smirk still in place but strained, like a mask he wasn't sure he could keep wearing. He'd expected her to falter, to strum a few clumsy chords and prove his point. Instead, she began to play. The first notes of a classic rock ballad spilled from her guitar, slow and soulful, each chord heavy with a feeling that seemed to pull the crowd into its orbit. The melody was familiar, a song from decades past, but Karoline's touch made it new, her fingers coaxing out a depth that felt like a conversation with the night itself. The crowd fell silent, phones lowering as people leaned forward, caught by the weight of her music. Halfway through, she shifted, her hands moving faster, and the ballad gave way to a searing solo. Her fingers danced across the fretboard, notes climbing and twisting with a skill that felt almost otherworldly, yet grounded in something deeply human. The sound was raw, electric, a cry that didn't need words. Max's smirk faded, his arms crossing tightly over his chest. He glanced at the crowd, searching for his supporters, but their eyes were on Karoline, their faces soft with awe. A gray-haired man in a denim jacket standing near the front nudged his wife, his voice low but urgent. "That's her." His wife's eyes widened, and she clutched his arm, whispering, "You're right." The silver pick in Karoline's hand flashed under the stage lights, its engraved initials J.H. glinting for a moment before she tucked it against the strings. A murmur rippled through the older fans, those who'd grown up with vinyl records and smoky concert halls. J.H. as in Johnny Hart, one woman said, her voice carrying just enough to stir others nearby. Johnny Hart, the rock legend whose ballads had defined a generation, whose sudden death had left a void in Nashville's music scene. Max caught the name, his laugh sharp and dismissive. "No way," he said, loud enough for the front row to hear. "You expect me to believe she's got anything to do with him?" But his voice lacked its earlier swagger, and his eyes darted to Karoline, searching for a crack in her calm. The festival organizer, Tom, stood off stage, his clipboard forgotten as he stared at Karoline's guitar. He'd seen that sunburst Fender before, years ago, in a grainy photo from a Johnny Hart concert. His assistant, a young woman named Lila, tugged at his sleeve. "Is that true? Is she?" Tom didn't answer, his jaw tight. The crowd's murmur grew, a mix of skepticism and wonder, as Karoline played on, her solo building to a crescendo that seemed to hold the entire park in its grip. She wasn't just playing, she was telling a story, one that Max couldn't interrupt, no matter how hard he tried. If you've ever carried a truth nobody else could see, then you know what Karoline felt as she stood there, her music louder than any taunt. The ballad ended, but she didn't stop. She transitioned into another riff, this one softer, almost mournful, as if she were speaking to someone who wasn't there. The crowd was starting to wonder, who was she, really? And what did that pick, those initials, mean? The Maple Ridge Park Festival in Nashville pulsed with a new energy as Karoline Leavitt's final note hung in the air, a haunting echo that seemed to settle into the bones of everyone watching. The crowd, moments ago a restless mix of cheers and skepticism, now erupted into applause, the sound swelling like a wave. Families on blankets stood, clapping, while teenagers near the stage lowered their phones, their faces caught between awe and disbelief. Some wiped tears, moved by a melody that stirred memories they couldn't quite place. Karoline stood still, her sunburst Fender Stratocaster resting against her hip, its scratches glinting under the stage lights. Her plaid shirt was slightly untucked, her auburn hair loose from its tie, but her hazel eyes held a quiet strength, as if she'd just laid down a weight she'd carried too long. Max, at the other end of the stage, stood frozen, his electric guitar limp in his hands, its glossy finish no match for the worn beauty of Karoline's. His blue hair fell into his eyes, and his earlier smirk was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped stare. He shifted his weight, his sneakers scuffing the stage, but he said nothing, his confidence unraveling like a dropped stitch. The festival organizer, Tom, pushed through the offstage shadows, his clipboard tucked under his arm, sweat beading on his brow. He approached Karoline, his voice low and unsteady, muttering about her unexpected talent as if he needed to explain the moment to himself. "I didn't know you could... that was something else," he said, his eyes darting to the crowd, which was still clapping, some shouting her name. Karoline nodded politely, her expression soft but unyielding, as if she'd heard such surprise before and knew it wasn't really about her playing. It was about who they thought she was or wasn't. A teenage girl with a nose ring, who'd mocked Karoline earlier, stood near the stage, her phone trembling as she posted a shaky video online. Her caption read, "Okay, I was wrong about her." The words already gaining likes as the clip spread. The girl's friend nudged her, whispering, "Did you know she could do that?" The girl shook her head, her cheeks flushed, as if she'd misjudged a stranger and now saw her clearly. The crowd parted slightly as a gray-haired man in a denim jacket, his face lined with years of music and late nights, pushed forward, clutching a faded concert ticket from a Johnny Hart show decades ago. His wife trailed behind, her eyes bright with recognition. He raised the ticket like a flag, his voice cutting through the applause. "Karoline, you learned from him, didn't you?" The question wasn't loud, but it carried, and heads turned, older fans nodding as if a puzzle piece had clicked into place. Karoline's gaze met his, and she nodded, a small, almost private gesture, her eyes softening with a memory she didn't share. The name Johnny Hart rippled through the crowd again, louder now, as whispers turned to murmurs. Max caught the exchange, his laugh forced, cracking under the weight of the moment. "Come on. That's just a story," he said, leaning into the mic. But his voice wavered, and the crowd's attention stayed on Karoline. He tried to strum a quick riff, a desperate grab for control, but the notes felt hollow, swallowed by the applause still ringing for her. The stage was no longer his, and he knew it, his hands trembling as he gripped his guitar. Tom's assistant, Lila, stood off stage, her lanyard twisted in her fingers. She'd been one of Max's biggest fans, drawn to his online bravado. But now she watched Karoline, her expression shifting. "She's not what I thought," Lila said to Tom, her voice barely audible. Tom didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the crowd, where phones were lighting up with new posts, clips of Karoline's solo spreading across social media. The tide had turned, not with a shout, but with a song, and Max's challenge now felt like a misstep he couldn't undo. Karoline stepped back from the mic, her boots soft on the stage, and adjusted her guitar strap, her movements calm, as if she'd done what she came to do. If you've ever been underestimated, judged by a label before you could show your truth, then you know what stirred in her heart a quiet victory. Not over Max, but over the assumptions that had tried to define her. The crowd's applause began to fade, but their eyes stayed on her, waiting for what came next. Could Max salvage this? Or was the truth too big to ignore? The answer lay in the silence that followed, a silence that wasn't empty but full of possibility. The Maple Ridge Park Festival in Nashville had transformed into a living pulse, the crowd's energy crackling like static under the starlit sky. The string lights swayed gently, casting a golden glow over the wooden stage where Karoline Leavitt stood, her sunburst Fender Stratocaster still slung across her shoulder. The applause from her performance had faded, but the air remained charged, heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. Her final notes had silenced the skeptics, and now every eye was on her, waiting for what came next. Karoline stepped to the microphone, her plaid shirt slightly rumpled, her auburn hair catching the light as she leaned forward. Her hazel eyes scanned the crowd not with triumph, but with a quiet resolve, as if she'd reached a crossroads she'd always known was coming. Her fingers, still warm from the strings, brushed the silver pick in her pocket, its engraved initials J, H, a silent anchor. She took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, clear, carrying the weight of years unspoken. "Johnny Hart was my father," she said. "He taught me to play before he left this world." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the crowd. A collective gasp rose, followed by a flurry of whispers, phones flashing as people scrambled to record the moment. Social media lit up, clips of Karoline's solo already spreading, now paired with her revelation. The name Johnny Hart, a legend whose ballads had shaped Nashville's soul, was no small thing here. Older fans clutched each other, nodding, while younger ones typed furiously, searching his name online. Max, standing at the stage's edge, felt the ground shift beneath him. His face paled, his blue hair falling into his eyes as he gripped his guitar, its glossy finish suddenly childish next to Karoline's weathered Fender. He'd challenged the daughter of a music icon, and the realization hit him like a cold wave. His mouth opened, then closed, his bravado crumbling under the crowd's gaze. The teenage girl with the nose ring, who'd mocked Karoline earlier, now stood at the front, her phone forgotten as she shouted, "She's the real deal." Her voice cut through the murmurs, and others echoed her, their cheers rising like a tide. Max stammered, stepping to his own mic, desperate to pivot. "This wasn't about skill," he said, his voice cracking. "It was about politics, about standing up to her kind of ideas, but the crowd wasn't buying it." Their applause for Karoline drowned his words, and a few shook their heads when unimpressed by his deflection. The gray-haired producer, his denim jacket creased from years of wear, climbed the stage steps, his faded Johnny Hart concert ticket held high like a badge of truth. His name was Earl, a retired music man who'd seen Hart play in '78, and his voice boomed with authority. "This woman carries her father's legacy," he said, pointing to Karoline. "You hear that in her music. That's no act." The crowd roared, some chanting Karoline as phones captured Earl's words, the moment trending online with hashtags like Johnny Hart's daughter. The festival organizer, Tom, stood off stage, his clipboard limp in his hands, his face a mix of awe and panic. He'd booked Max for his viral fame, not expecting this. And now Karoline's truth had upended the night. His assistant, Leela, who'd once cheered Max's videos, now watched Karoline, her eyes wide. "I had no idea," she whispered. And Tom only nodded, his mind racing, Max's shoulders slumped, his guitar hanging heavy. He'd misjudged her. Not just her skill, but her story, and the crowd's shift was undeniable. He tried to laugh, a weak attempt to save face, but it died in his throat. Karoline didn't look at him, didn't need to. She stood there, her boots planted, her gaze on the crowd, as if speaking to them alone. If you've ever had to prove who you are, to step out from someone else's shadow, then you know what this moment meant to her. She hadn't come to win a duel, she'd come to honor a memory, and in doing so, she'd changed the stage they shared. The truth didn't need to shout anymore, it was loud in the crowd's cheers, in the clips racing across the internet, in the way Max's defiance faltered. Earl stepped closer to Karoline, his ticket still raised, and the crowd leaned in, sensing more was coming. What would Max do now? And how would Karoline carry this moment forward? The Maple Ridge Park Festival in Nashville had settled into a softer rhythm, the string lights casting a gentle glow over the wooden stage, their amber warmth blending with the cool night air. The crowd, still buzzing from Karoline Leavitt's revelation, had quieted, their earlier cheers softening into a warm hum of respect, like the aftermath of a summer storm. Families on blankets exchanged glances, teenagers whispered in small clusters, and older fans nodded knowingly, as if a long-buried truth had finally surfaced. Karoline stood at the stage's center, her sunburst Fender Stratocaster now resting against an amp, its scratched body a silent testament to years of music and memory. She set the guitar down with care, her shoulders relaxing for the first time all night, as if she'd shed a weight she'd carried through every note. Her plaid shirt was creased, her auburn hair loose and slightly tangled, but her hazel eyes held a quiet light, a mix of relief and something deeper, like she'd honored a promise to someone far away. Max lingered at the stage's edge, his blue hair falling into his eyes, his electric guitar dangling from its strap. His hands trembled, the glossy instrument suddenly heavy. As he looked away from Karoline, his gaze fixed on the crowd but seeing nothing. The bravado that had fueled his challenge was gone, replaced by a tightness in his chest, a realization that he'd misjudged not just her skill but her heart. The crowd's attention had shifted, their phones now capturing Karoline's calm presence rather than his theatrics, and the weight of that shift pressed against him. The teenage girl with the nose ring, who'd once mocked Karoline, stepped forward, her sneakers scuffing the grass as she approached the stage. Her face was flushed, her eyes shy but earnest. "I didn't know who you were," she said, her voice small but clear. "I'm sorry." Karoline's lips curved into a gentle smile, and she reached into her pocket, pulling out the silver pick with its engraved initials. J.H. She held it out to the girl, her fingers steady. "It's not about who I am," she said. "It's about what we share." The girl took the pick, her eyes wide, clutching it like a treasure as she stepped back, her friends murmuring in awe. The gesture was small, but it rippled through the crowd, a moment of connection that felt bigger than the stage. The gray-haired producer, Earl, stood nearby, his denim jacket creased, his faded Johnny Hart ticket tucked into his pocket. He'd climbed down from the stage but now approached Karoline again, his voice low, almost reverent. "I've got a friend who books the Bluebird Cafe," he said, leaning close so only she could hear. "You belong there, Karoline. Let me make a call." Her eyes glistened, a flicker of emotion breaking through her calm, as if her father's memory had been honored tonight, not just by her playing but by the way it had brought people together. She nodded, her throat tight, and whispered, "Thank you." The festival organizer, Tom, hovered off stage, his clipboard forgotten, his glasses fogging slightly as he watched the scene unfold. His assistant, Leela, stood beside him, her lanyard twisted in her fingers. She'd been one of Max's biggest fans, but now her eyes followed Karoline, her earlier doubts replaced by quiet admiration. She didn't have to do this, Lila said almost to herself. Tom nodded, his jaw tight, knowing the night had shifted in ways he hadn't planned. Social media was alight with clips of Karoline's performance, hashtags like Johnny Hart's daughter trending alongside videos of her handing the pic to the girl. The crowd's hum grew softer, but their respect was palpable, a warmth that wrapped around Karoline like a familiar song. Max shifted, his sneakers scuffing the stage, and for a moment, it seemed he might speak, might try to claw back some control, but he didn't. His hands dropped to his sides and he stepped back, letting the spotlight stay on Karoline. The air felt lighter, like justice had settled in without a fight, without a single raised voice. If you've ever stood up for something true knowing it might cost you, then you know what Karoline felt in that moment. She hadn't come to shame Max or to prove a point. She'd come to play, to remember, and in doing so, she'd let them see their mistake. There was no need for anger, no need for words sharper than her music. The truth was loud enough, carried in the crowd's respect, in the glint of that silver pick, in the promise of a gig at the Bluebird. And sometimes, that's the loudest truth of all. As Earl stepped away, his eyes met Karoline's, and a silent understanding passed between them. What would happen next? When the stage lights dimmed and the crowd went home, the Maple Ridge Park Festival had faded into memory, its string lights packed away. The Nashville Park now quiet under a late summer moon. The grass, once trampled by families and teenagers, had begun to spring back, and the wooden stage stood empty, its boards creaking softly in the night breeze. But the story of that evening, the night Karoline Leavitt stepped into a spotlight she hadn't sought, lived on, carried in whispers, phone screens, and the hearts of those who'd been there. Karoline's performance had gone viral, clips of her soulful ballad and searing solo shared across social media, not just for her skill but for the grace she'd shown in the face of Max's challenge. Her revelation about Johnny Hart, her father, had added weight to the moment. But it was her quiet strength, her refusal to meet taunts with anger, that lingered most. Local news outlets picked up the story, their headlines praising the festival for bridging divides through music, for proving that a stage could be more than a battleground. Karoline, back in her modest apartment on the city's edge, didn't read the articles or scroll through the comments. She sat cross-legged on her living room floor, her sunburst Fender Stratocaster propped nearby, its scratches catching the lamplight. A turntable spun one of her father's old records, the crackle of vinyl filling the room as his voice, warm and weathered, sang a ballad she'd heard 1,000 times. She was practicing for her upcoming gig at the Bluebird Cafe, her fingers tracing chords she'd learned as a girl, each note a thread to the past. Her plaid shirt was folded on a chair, replaced by a soft sweater, her auburn hair tied back loosely. Her hazel eyes, often guarded, were soft now, reflecting a peace she hadn't felt in years. She didn't gloat over the festival's aftermath, didn't linger on the victory. To her, it wasn't about winning. It was about honoring a memory, about letting music speak where words might fail. Max, meanwhile, had retreated to his family's suburban home, his blue hair no longer a bold statement but a quiet reminder of a night he'd misread. He'd posted a short apology online, his words simple but earnest. "I judged her too fast." She's the real thing. The post gained traction not for its drama but for its humility, a rare admission from a teenager whose TikTok fame had been built on bravado. Some of his followers unfollowed, but others stayed, drawn to the honesty. Max didn't play his guitar for a few days, the glossy instrument untouched in its stand. When he finally picked it up, he tried a slower song, one closer to Karoline's style, as if searching for something he'd missed. The teenage girl with the nose ring, whose name was Sophie, kept the silver pick Karoline had given her on her desk, its engraved initials J.H., a reminder to look beyond labels. She'd shown it to her friends at school, telling the story of the festival with a mix of pride and sheepishness. "I thought she was just some politician," Sophie admitted, and her friends nodded, some sharing their own stories of snap judgments. The pick wasn't just a keepsake, it was a lesson, one Sophie carried as she scrolled less and listened more. The festival organizer, Tom, had fielded calls from local reporters, his voice steadier now as he spoke of the night's unexpected turn. His assistant, Lila, had clipped articles for the festival's scrapbook, her earlier fandom of Max replaced by a quiet respect for Karoline. The Bluebird gig, confirmed by Earl's connection, was already generating buzz, with tickets selling out in hours. Nashville, a city that cherished its music, felt a subtle shift, a reminder that talent and truth could cut through noise. The world hadn't changed overnight, but a small corner of the city felt different, as if a song had reminded people to pause, to see each other. Karoline, strumming softly in her apartment, didn't think about the headlines or the hashtags. She thought about her father, about the nights he'd taught her to play, about the way he'd said music was for sharing, not proving. Her eyes glistened, not with tears but with a quiet gratitude. If you've ever stood up, not for glory but for something true, then you know what this moment meant to her. She'd walked onto that stage to answer a challenge, but she'd left it with something more, a connection, a memory honored, a truth shared. The record spun on, its final notes fading into silence. Because sometimes, you don't need to shout to be heard. You just stand there, play your truth, and let it echo. And as Karoline set her guitar down, the city outside hummed with the promise of her next song. Karoline walked off the stage, her guitar case swinging lightly at her side, leaving the crowd's hum behind. The night felt still, as if the world had paused to listen. Justice didn't roar. It settled in the quiet of her steps. Hadn't it always been this way, truth speaking softest when it mattered most? Sometimes the loudest victories are the ones that don't need a single word.